And those are our online attendees. Hi, welcome everybody who's on the phone. My name is Kate Gillis. I am one of the chairs of the Gender-Based Violence Task Force. I'm with Population Reference Bureau, and I'm joined today by my co-chair, Rose Wiltshire from FHI 360, and by our two wonderful gender champions from USAID, Nihal Abni and Afifa Abdul Rahman. So for those of you who may be new, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Gender-Based Violence Task Force. We sit under the umbrella of the Interagency Gender Working Group that's supported by the Office of Population and Reproductive Health under USAID's Bureau of Global Health Bureau. Sorry, that's a lot of information to get in there. And as you all probably saw, this is the second part. This is the second event in a two-part series on addressing gender-based violence through cash transfer programming. Today's event is focused on supporting adolescent girls and working in humanitarian settings. So you'll see we have presenters who are coming from very different perspectives on this, which is pretty exciting. When we first started to think about doing an event on cash transfers and gender-based violence, we thought, we would be able to have a presenter as part of perhaps a larger event on economic empowerment. And then when we went to look at the research, we realized there was enough new research and thinking specifically on cash transfers and gender-based violence and other reproductive health outcomes that we could not only do a full event, but we could do two events. So that's why we're here today. The first event was on September 17th. You can find all the materials online from that event. Speakers from there were from the World Bank, from Johns Hopkins, and from UNC. And the thing that we felt was really special about that event and that we're looking forward to again today is that it truly drew from across sectors beyond just the health sector when thinking about gender-based violence and how you can approach addressing gender-based violence. The Interagency Gender Working Group, as I mentioned, is supported by USAID, but one of the mandates is to draw together people from different agencies, from different organizations, from across sectors to talk about issues related to gender. And this intersection, this cash transfers and GBV, has really proven to be a nexus for doing that. And so that is, and I'll share a quote from the first event from Kathy Linder, who's our World Bank speaker there. And she said, "I never imagined how significant the impacts of cash transfers would be on other aspects of life, including GBV and HIV. It's so meaningful to hear about all those impacts. They may be second-order impacts for the economists, but they are certainly first-order impacts for the women they are empowering." So for us, hearing that from somebody who knows so much about cash transfers and how they impact people's lives, hearing that she took away something new from that was really exciting. We're hoping that the same will be true for you all today. We have an equally diverse lineup of speakers. So first we have Burke Osler from the World Bank. He's going to be talking about how can cash programming contribute to efforts aiming to reduce GBV. Burke is a lead economist in the poverty cluster of the World Bank's Development Research Group. He has a particular interest in cash transfer programs and HIV risks faced by young women in Africa and has done some field experiments in Malawi based on that. He's also a co-founder and regular contributor to the Development Impact blog from the World Bank. I had a chance to read several of his contributions there and encourage you to look. Next up, we're going to have Kate Bowles from the International Rescue Committee presenting on cash transfers and GBV and humanitarian emergencies. Kate is a senior researcher at IRC, where she focuses on evaluating programming to better prevent and respond to violence against women and girls in humanitarian settings. And then we'll be joined remotely by Karen Austrian, who's going to present on testing the effects of cash versus cash plus empowerment for young adolescent girls in Kenya. Karen is a senior associate with the Population Council's Poverty, Gender, and Youth program. She's based in Nairobi, Kenya, where she leads council projects in East and Southern Africa and develops, implements, and evaluates programs that build girls' protected assets. And finally, we are really excited for a lightning talk by Tenzin Manal from the Women's Refugee Commission on the toolkit for optimizing cash-based interventions for protection from gender-based violence. Tenzin is a senior technical advisor for the Cash and Livelihoods program at the Women's Refugee Commission. She conducts action research, provides technical assistance to cash and livelihood actors to ensure gender-sensitive and protective assistance, and advocates for evidence-based practice that promotes resilience and self-reliance. So I will ask you to hold your questions until the end. We are trying to allow a lot of time for discussion. That's going to include questions from people who are joining remotely. So if you all have questions, you can type them into the chat box, and we'll try and make sure those get factored in. A couple of logistical notes before we get started. Restroom keys are over there by the coffee. There's a key to let you into the restroom and a key to let you back in, and you'll see signs as you go down the hallway. Please turn off your phones or put them on silent so that, yeah, exactly, I'm going to have to do the same. Anything that I'm forgetting? All right, with that, I'm going to hand things over to our first speaker, Bert.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I actually took a good while, the organizers will attest, before accepting.
Oh, sorry, we need to be a little closer.
Yeah, I'll just hold it. Before accepting, mainly because I wasn't sure what my contribution exactly would be. So those of you who may know a little bit of my work may know that I know quite a bit about cash transfers, and I can assure you that I know very little about you. And so I do work on adolescent health quite a bit. So there's some overlap there, but honestly, like until I had to prepare this talk, I hadn't really thought much about how cash transfers may or may not affect GBV. So the organizers asked me to give me the kind of like the from high above look at kind of like cash transfers and what they do. I know Kathy Lindert for a long time. I'm happy to hear that she was kind of giving this message that yes, we give cash transfers to people to reduce poverty, but they do a lot more than that. I think in economics now we've known that for a good while, and for us economists actually they're not secondary at all. And I can assure you that HIV reduction or teen pregnancies or mental health or empowerment or anything else is as important as current poverty reduction. That's for sure. But one of the things that we're struggling with currently, feel like my job has become a little bit to kind of like tamp down the excitement about cash, like over the last almost like decade, but maybe I'm going to say like the last 3 to 5 years, it's really gone crazy. Especially with the entry of like charities like Give Directly into the fold. It's just people are really kind of excited about just giving cash and then thinking that we don't have to think about hard problems anymore because we just give cash, things will be better. There is some morsel of truth to that, but I think it's really lazy thinking. And I think that it's like on us, especially as researchers and policymakers, to not stop thinking about the hard problems and then how to solve them, and then how does cash fit into that is maybe my epsilon contribution here. So one of the things I like to talk about is that yes, cash is great. So I have studies that have shown, adolescent females, we gave them like $10 a month in Malawi. Their mental health was better. There were less teen pregnancies. There were less child marriages. HIV rates went down. Herpes virus rates went down. They did better at school, etc. But as soon as we stopped giving the cash, their life went right back to where it was, right? And I wish I could tell you that that's just a one-off, but it's not. Like study after study now, we're seeing that cash transfers are great when you have money in your pocket. Things are better, for sure. I don't doubt that one bit. But by and large, we haven't figured out how to make these programs alter trajectories of life. Like they don't, whether you want to talk about livelihoods programs, whether you want to talk about vocational training, etc., safety nets programs that a lot of governments do, kind of like people talk about graduation, we don't have a lot of successful graduation. So it's a little note. So thinking about GBV now, there are obvious to an economist, or somebody who knows the research a little bit, there are some obvious channels by which cash transfers by themselves rather than livelihoods programs, etc., would reduce GBV. One of them is reduced stress. I mean, there's a fair amount of studies now that show whether it's you're measuring cortisol, whether it's you're doing a scale for like anxiety and depression, etc. I can show you that when people have money, they're just much less stressed, much happier subject, right? And that does have an effect. I mean, you do see quotes from some of the studies I'm going to cite here. People are saying, oh, he's so much happier, and then GBV just seems to be less. So similarly, I put it in the same box, but money can also reduce intra-household conflict. So one of the quotes that I saw in one of the papers was, whenever I need something for the kids or for the house or whatever, I have to go ask him, and he gets angry when he doesn't have the money. So then he lashes out on me. So certainly being richer, even temporarily, can reduce GBV. Then the second thing is being richer can increase your bargaining power, right? So economists talk about threat points. There's a game theory notion. It's just your fallback position, right? So when would you leave a relationship, right? So the better that position is, the less likely your partner is supposed to abuse you. So when you have more money, when you have social support, when you have family around who will take you, when you have a social network, those points are more favorable to you, so you can threaten to leave if this doesn't stop. Right? So those are there, but in my mind, they're equally likely to disappear, just like these other studies that I talked to you about once cash goes away. Right? Because unless I've made somebody permanently richer or permanently more powerful in terms of bargaining, or like permanently happier, then I don't have any reason to think that things aren't going to go back the way they were. This is a speculation. Maybe there is something about things changing that makes them stick, right? Even though the underlying conditions haven't, right? But I don't know. I don't know. But evaluations of cash transfer programs, whether they're government, whether they're NGO, whether they're food or vouchers or in cash or in kind, whether they're unconditional or conditional on schooling or going to visit clinics for your kids' vaccinations and things like that, generally show reductions in physical intrapartner violence, right? I add the physical there mainly because the studies generally do not show reductions in mental violence, and then I haven't seen a whole lot on sexual violence. Maybe because most of these studies focus on families, whereas I don't. So I think about that much more, like what adolescents face is not within marriage sexual violence or even physical violence, but otherwise. But nonetheless, like there are studies that are quite promising. Now, let me zoom through a little bit. So if I do then think that you have two choices here, either you have a program that gives cash and does some other things and changes some of those underlying channels permanently such that after you stop the program, things are better, period, or you haven't figured it out yet, right? Then what might you do? One of the things is in continuing to figure it out, you say, well, okay, maybe cash itself isn't enough, but combined with something, it might, right? The reason I spent a couple slides on this paper by Shalini Roy, Hidrobo, and a couple of other colleagues is that I've seen actually 4 media pieces in the last month on this. Like there was Vox piece, there was an NPR piece, I think there might have been a Times piece, and it's forthcoming in the Review of Economics and Statistics. And it's a program that this BCC stands for Behavior Change Communication, right? But as all things BRAC in Bangladesh do, it's a really intensive and expensive program. So what they do is they have 2-year program where women get together with a leader from the community, and they're talking about, these are all mothers of 0 to 2-year-old kids, or they're pregnant, and they're talking about nutrition, mainly, right? And it's like maybe 10, 12 women in a village, and then they're meeting weekly, and the average amount of times they met in a year in the study is 48 months, right? So for 2 years, right? I have lots of colleagues who work on this stuff, and they're like, well, how do you do that, right? And yes, John Hodnott is a colleague of mine, and I talked to him a little bit about this because this program was actually also successful in reducing stunting rates. And those all make sense to me because some of the things that they do are really interesting. They don't just tell you what to feed your child, they actually teach you physically how to prepare an item into the baby's food while not making the rest of the family unhappy, right? How do you put eggs into something, etc. So that program, so this, they published this paper completely separately from all the other outcomes, like the main interest of the thing is that they've done an experiment where they had the BCC plus cash, and then they had just cash, right? And what they see is that there's a huge reduction in physical violence. When I say huge, it's a 26% reduction. So maybe about 27% of the women were reporting some violence in the last 6 months, and then that went down to 20, right? And there's no reduction whatsoever in the cash arm itself, about 6 months after the program ended. Right? And so why? And the authors go through kind of like the scenarios. And one of the things is they say, well, these families actually really status in the community increases a little bit. Their neighbors are actually coming and asking, oh, what did you learn last week and what can we do, etc. But then also they have bits of the program where some weeks, like the rest of the family is also supposed to come. And then you're there with this new group in Bangladesh. This is Bangladesh, right? So a lot of these women may not have been out of the house much before, and now they have this new network, right? So one of the things they kind of emphasize is that maybe the social cost of physical violence has gone up, meaning that actually it will now, the physical manifestations will be seen by other people, and then you will be somehow shamed, right? So that does make sense to me. It's plausible. But notice that that has nothing to do with cash, right? I'll come to this at the end. The only thing it might have to do with cash is the fact that cash may have been what brought people to the program in the first place. But cash itself, not really, right? So now they also talk about women improvements in women's threat points, and then show that like this, you know, these households are better off 6 to 10 months later, much better than the cash arm. So they're saying, well, we think actually that some of that other stress and conflict channels are also likely to be playing in play. But I don't, that is the part of the paper that I didn't really buy. But you mentioned my blog. This is what I do for a living. Like, I criticize papers, other people's work. That's what I've done, or better or worse. But you know, so, and I really scrutinize papers to see kind of like what's going on. Can I make sense of it? There are some empirical oddities here. So for example, this is going to tie into what I want to say about measurement of GBV. You know, so there's a variable on control over money. So this is kind of like a proxy for your inter-household bargaining power, right? In the midline and the end line, 70% of the women reported some or, you know, a fair amount of control over the money that's coming in through the program or otherwise, which went straight down to 38% afterwards, but in control villages, right? Where there is no program going on whatsoever. Like, so that suggests to me that there was something happening like everywhere, and I don't know what it is, but it could very well be social desirability bias or something like that. You know, what you say is not real, and it changes with the program. Plus, BCC had, which was on nutrition, like teaching people how to, you know, how to feed children mainly, doubles the impact on consumption and triples the impact on assets of the household 6 to 10 months later. I'm not sure how that happened. We have lots of really programs that try to do this stuff and don't succeed. And here is a program that just got people to get together for 104 weeks, and it has almost these like magical impacts. I'm not saying they're not correct. That's what the data the authors have, but I'm not sure how it happened. There's something going on here that I can't really say. And then finally, 6 to 10 months after the program isn't really too far away from the end of the program, given especially that the recall period is 6 months, right? So you're asking people in the past 6 months, did you get slapped, for example, something like that. So I'd like to see a little more farther away effects for the authors to say, we think there's something sustained here rather than temporary, right? So, but then the biggest thing is like all the criticisms of Brack's work, from wonderful work, for Bangladesh from 40, 50 years going now, is that can you really replicate this kind of stuff elsewhere, right? There's actually a job market paper that just came out that we blogged about in our blog, that they've done the same thing in Ethiopia, but reduced it to 3 months. They didn't look at IPV, they looked at nutrition. They show equally impressive results with respect to nutrition. So it seems like you can teach that stuff and give people money or food vouchers to just say, okay, like put in more animal proteins and fruits and vegetables into your baby's food once started being weaned. So yes, maybe, but would that have is 3 months enough to see these kinds of effects on GBV? I'm not sure. Now, what does that say about measurement? Like, this is one of the reasons I always feel a little hesitant working in this field, because I am just not comfortable with the measures that we're using, because we're asking people something that happened that's really stigmatized to talk about. So, like I said, there's some strange things in there about, how did the control group have 70% control over money, and then 6 months later it went down to 30? And then treatment effects are the same, meaning that everybody's levels are just topping off in the study and after the study. That suggests to me something about the study rather than the reality, right? Or given that they were in control groups where there are actually spillovers, and spillovers in actually self-reporting, right? Which is really problematic. And economists think about this stuff a lot, because if we can't measure something well, it doesn't mean that it's not an important question. It's just that I'm not able to tell you much about it when I do an RCT. I have like a Cadillac, and then I put into its gas tank like Pinto gas. Like it's just gonna blow up, right? So Melissa Hidrobo, actually, I think you should invite her to talk about cash transfers. She seems to have like 3, 4 studies. I think like when I talk to people, they say she's really the expert. She's in Senegal, so you might have to connect her to like Karen. Yeah, so you might invite her to talk. And their work is great. They're always using quantitative methods with qualitative methods, mixing them together to get some sense of kind of like the quantitative stuff isn't completely noise and there's some signal in it. But what I think I'd like to see, I always thought that if somebody is suffering inter-partner violence or gender-based violence or being abused, there should be psychological manifestation. So, and maybe 1 study, 2 studies, should just spend the money to actually have people have in-depth interviews by psychiatrists with people, right, to see what's going on. Maybe that would be more convincing to me rather than a few scales or binary questions like, did this happen to you, did that happen to you? It's hard for me to think that you're going to be part of a program for 104 weeks and your answers are going to be exactly the same as somebody who wasn't part of the same program. In developed countries, people do use hospital and clinic records for serious injuries. I know that in developing countries, this may be not realistic, but it's something to think about. Like the study that I'm going to talk about that we did for 2 minutes at the end, IRC actually trained all the local providers on, survivors of abuse to kind of like how to deal with it. And then people may have other novel ideas, but I think until we are really confident in kind of like the answers we're getting to these questions, there's always going to be a little bit of a question. Now, what does this mean for adolescents? I'm going to say a whole lot of the stuff I talked to, perhaps not much, mainly because this threat point into household bargaining is kind of irrelevant for adolescents unless they're married. Now, you might be able to change that if you delay pregnancies and marriages, and then that leads them to have better marriage market outcomes and better labor market outcomes, so which improve their inter-household bargaining power, their future marriages, essentially. But again, evidence on that is really weak. And in fact, actually in Malawi, what we saw depressingly is that the girls who delayed marriage ended up marrying worse husbands. Because almost like they missed out, their cohort was moving on and they weren't, right? So, so I'm not sure, I think cash transfers, people get excited about them rightly maybe, but there's an entire surrounding environment in which there's an economy and then there's supposed to be good jobs and safe jobs and things to do. And culturally accepted like modes of operation for people to take advantage of those 2 extra years in youth while things were better, right? So, and then finally, like I said, a lot of these studies, maybe I missed it because I didn't read all the footnotes, but I didn't see a lot about sexual violence in these studies. They were mostly about physical and psychological violence. Now, I have maybe 1 minute, so I'll just quickly give you cliff notes, and somebody else from IRC is talking after me, so they might just chip in a little bit. So we did with IRC evaluate a program called Girl Empower, which was a 32-week life skills curriculum targeted to really young adolescents, females. And then we did it with and without cash transfers tied to attendance. And it was an interesting one. With Ginny Anand and the other co-PIs, we debated how to do it for a long time. And then in the end, I think what we wanted was for an organization like IRC, which is thinking of incorporating cash transfer programming into their kind of like programming in general, other than humanitarian settings, which Kate will talk about. I think there's 2 things. One is that you will have an income effect, in which case you just want to give decent amounts of cash. Or you will have actually an incentive for people to take up your programs, right? And we decided to test the latter one and not the former one. So actually we gave very little amounts, but we tied it to each of the 32 sessions. So for each time you attended, you and your parents got like $1.25. So it adds up to like $40 over the course of it. And then plus they had some savings components. So over the course of a year, maybe people in this Girl Empower Plus cash arm got about $56. And then we had caregiver sessions once a month, and then there was local capacity building for health and social service providers for survivors of GBV. Don't worry about this table. The thing that I want you to take away is that, so because we did talk about gender norms and attitudes towards IPV, what we talked about, one of the things is maybe the social capital of these women are changing, and that improves your threat point in your marriage, right? So if there is some slack in that, it is simply that you underestimated how much your husband actually will put up with, right? You might learn, and then you may just close up that slack, right? And then that sticks afterwards, right? So if I actually decide that I'm going to put up with less IPV, right? Maybe actually I get away with some of it, even if I don't get away with all, right? It doesn't all have to do with my economic power, my bargaining position in the house, right? So to that end, maybe these things are good things. Both Girl Empower itself and with or without cash did pretty good. These are sizable FX sizes on standardized measures. We asked them about their acceptance of IPV. In general, they do much better than the control group, but a year after the program is ended, right? The really interesting thing, and this is actually, borne by a lot of other studies, including my Malawi study, the cash plus the GE program did really well reducing marriages, pregnancies, number of sexual partners, and improving safe sex. More so than GE did itself. And this is something that we see regularly. Like adolescent sexual behavior is really tied to how much money they have in their pocket, right? But like I said, it doesn't seem to stick. So, but this is not just true in Malawi or Liberia. This is true in the United States. Young women who win the lottery get married later, right? So there are studies that I can show you. Right? So here we have this interesting thing where Girl Empower is doing something for sure, but plus cash, even the tiny amount of cash that we gave, is making them do so much better. And we had a whole seminar where we discussed why this might be the case. I'm not going to have time going into it, but we can discuss maybe in Q&A. But the thing that I want to highlight here is that these were the 7 domains that we were interested in. These are the ones that we had an effect in, which is sexual, reproductive health, family formation, and the gender norms that I talked to you about. But nothing on sexual violence, nothing on psychological well-being, and nothing on protective factors. This is we're measuring their guardians and parents and their behavior and their attitudes towards the girl child and how they're reporting their feelings and their actions. We see nothing there. Whether or not it's because we're not measuring these things well, we're using the latest, VAX and things like that. Kelly Holman is my co-PI on this. or whether it's because the program really didn't do anything, I don't know, but that's what we have. So that was actually disappointing. The reason why we talk about this stuff is mainly because there's nothing going on here. So the last thing I said, this is my last slide. The last thing I'll say is that so this Girl Empower program combined with cash kind of pretty clearly outperformed Girl Empower only in this kind of like delaying marriage and sexual debut and then having, more improved reported self-reported safe sex. Why? In our case, it's not because it improved attendance. Actually, attendance was identical in both arms because they were so high. IRC seems to do a really good job running some of their programs. So 90% of the time, girls were there attending if they were offered to be part of this club. So it's either a direct income effect or it's an interaction effect with GB. It's like a complementary parity. But unfortunately, the study design doesn't allow us to talk about it. And that's where I'll end, is that the organizers said, what do you think about future work? I'm seeing a lot of studies that have 3 arms. And this is completely non-classical. Like the classical factorial design is like a 2x2 or a 3x2, where you have each cell covered. What I mean by that, you have cash, no cash. You have girl programming, no girl programming. And you have the full interaction of all of those things with and without each other. Only then you can separate out everything, right? But either for money reasons or some other reasons, we're seeing a lot of studies that are just cash and cash plus BCC and a pure control group, or vice versa, BCC plus cash, but then the fourth group is not there. And that's really making us kind of wave our hands at the end and say, well, we think it's one of these 2 things, but we don't know. So I really do encourage you, like if you're working with people who are giving you money to do studies on this, just do the full, fully interaction factorial design. And the last word here is that, yes, I think this study that we've done, unlike these other studies that I talked about, doesn't really show any effects on GBV, whether or not that's because it's about adolescence and the pathways through adolescence suffer these things are very different than what happens inside like married households, or something else. I'm not sure, but maybe that's, for future purposes, I think that there's a lot more on this, it seems to me, about adults than there is about adolescents. So maybe more studies that look at early to mid adolescence, up to kind of like young women, like up to 24, I think would be more useful than doing more studies among, let's say, social safety net recipients, married couples.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I want to encourage everybody to be jotting down your questions, because I don't know, I think that presentation, there's a lot of fodder for discussion that's going to come from that. So jot down your questions, keep them in mind, and we'll return to them after all of our speakers have presented. So now I'm going to hand it over to Kate Fall from IRC.
Thank you. So I'll be following that presentation and build out some of our thinking on specifically how cash transfer programming might be operating in relation to gender-based violence in more acute humanitarian emergency settings. And so some of you may know that in recent years, humanitarian agencies, specifically dozens of them, have made public commitments to increase their use of cash transfers in emergency settings, largely because of their positive impacts on a range of outcomes, and it can help reach the highest number of people in the most amount of need in some of the shortest period of time in the days in the aftermath of a crisis. And what we know in terms of gender-based violence and women's economic empowerment is that it is generally positive, although there's still somewhat mixed findings on these outcomes. And then just setting the stage a little bit more in terms of women and girls in emergencies, we also know that there are broadly, more generally speaking, increased risk of violence and exploitation. And this is due to a variety of reasons like family separation, a breakdown of community and social structures, or just a normalization of violence. And so within this background and this context, we just need to ensure that cash transfers delivered by humanitarian organizations support women and girls to be safe and empowered and ensure that they do not exacerbate any risk that they may be experiencing. And as part of this work, IRC itself has made a commitment to deliver at least 25% of its humanitarian aid through cash transfers by 2020. And we're aligning that alongside some learning to make sure that we do it well. And so we have one stream of research at IRC that's focused specifically on the impact of cash transfers on protection outcomes. So that could be intimate partner violence or sexual exploitation. And then we have another stream of research that's focused on risk mitigation within cash programming, and that is specifically how do we ensure that we minimize protection risks within any programming that's being delivered. So I'll unpack some of this just by focusing on one study that was recently completed from some of our research in Syria. And the overarching research question that we were interested in examining within this study was, what is the impact of cash transfers on women's experiences of violence, negative coping, including sexual exploitation, and well-being in acute emergency setting. And the acute emergency part of that is a really key component. It actually took us 3 years to launch this study through a number of different scoping exercises and trying to align programmatic resources alongside research in a number of emergencies that could be occurring in the future. So trying to ensure that we're not delaying any programming and include the feasibility of different designs like RCTs or regression discontinuity. And after all of this period of about 3 years, we landed on discussing or launching the study in northern Syria on recently accessible sites in that setting as they were recently liberated from ISIS. And in addition, there was a mass influx of internally displaced people from the airstrikes in Raqqa in that setting. So it really, whilst it was inside of a protracted emergency, really did mirror an acute emergency, at least in terms of our own programming purposes. And so the cash program that we evaluated and looked at was a 3-month multi-purpose and unconditional cash transfer program. So multi-purpose means there were no restrictions set on what people could spend it on, and unconditional meant that they didn't have to attend any programming or anything else to receive the cash. They received about $76 a month for 3 months, which is based off of, in normal humanitarian aid targeting practices, just your sort of household basket. And then households were also targeted based on their vulnerability scores. And these were highly, highly vulnerable settings. So most people did reach those households. And importantly, these households and recipients weren't targeted based on whether they were a man or a woman. It was just broad stroke, what humanitarian aid programming typically looks at in these settings. And I have here our theory of change. Cash transfers reduce basic needs. That is literally all they're trying to do in these acute emergency settings, which is perfectly fine. But we also know that a lot of things can happen when we infuse families with cash. And so we built this out through some of our programmatic colleague consultations, as well as some of the recent literature reviews that Lori Heisey and others have presented on, I think, the last cash transfer session. And so we developed this theory of change to guide our thinking around this study. And so essentially on the bottom line, we see that cash transfers can hopefully help households meet their basic needs. And this could potentially result in 2 different things. One, there's less negative coping, which is kind of a term that's used more in the cash transfer world, but it's really around things that people engage in to meet their basic needs, like going into debt or begging, transactional sex, and different factors. The other thing that could happen is when household basic needs are met, less household stress, and that could potentially influence intimate partner violence. And then on the upper part of the theory of change, we could see that if cash is given, particularly to women, potentially there's an increase in control, there's an empowerment pathway to which it could influence intimate partner violence. So this is our overarching thinking for this work in acute emergency settings. We did a quantitative pre and post test with qualitative in-depth interviews at Endline. As I mentioned, this is an acute emergency. We tried to do a more rigorous design, but this was the most feasible and ethical. It still provided a lot of really useful insights. And the data collection was actually just completed in August this year. And overall, we had about 450 participating. And what did we learn? Overall, between baseline and Endline, there were fairly consistent positive changes in reducing basic needs and economic-related outcomes, but there were really mixed findings on protection-related outcomes. And again, I'll be saying this probably multiple times throughout, we cannot infer causality due to the study design. So thinking about our first mechanism, does cash transfer help households meet basic needs? This was operationalized through the construct of food insecurity, and we did see significant reductions in this metric for women. And we also saw in the qualitative work that a lot of households were in fact spending this cash on helping them meet their basic needs, and paying back debts and medical expenses. We also saw that there were really clear differences of spending habits based on the order of transfers. So there were 3 transfers, as I mentioned, in this cash transfer program. And the first one, women were really spending it on food, clothing, etc. But when you move towards the later ones down the line, they're really talking about now debts, medical expenses, maybe capital investments for their home if they have enough money. So we think this pathway might hold, that cash is meeting its primary purpose of helping households meet basic needs. And so then we turn to, well, does that affect any negative coping in the homes? And overall, what we saw is that there were reductions in economic negative coping, and significantly so for family debt, begging, selling productive assets, and skipping rents. So overall, those are pretty positive findings that cash is helping families. But when we turn to more of the protection-related outcomes that might be more exploitative in nature, what we see is actually no significant changes on exploitative work for women or child labor within the home. And so what we take away from this, and with our qualitative work and consultations with our program team, is that these families know that this is a 3-month program. They're not going to actually disengage in employment practices that could provide more sustainable sources of income, even if they are exploitative in nature during the cash transfer program. We also saw significant increases in family separation related to work purposes, but we think this is probably related to contextual issue of the fact that a lot of men were returning to Raqqa City for employment because it was recently demined, but it was still quite unsafe for families to return with them. So we think this is largely a contextual factor, not related to the cash program. And then, as I mentioned, our key outcome was around sexual exploitation and abuse, which is was asked around if they're having to engage or trade sex to get food, clothing, shelter, etc. And we saw at baseline about 5% of women, or 1 in 20, reported experiencing this. But unfortunately, due to a number of factors, we couldn't actually access that end line, so we don't have data. So we're still piecing together from the qualitative what is actually happening with this phenomenon, if it actually reduced during the period of cash transit. So moving onwards in our theory of change, we wanted to now see if once basic household needs were met, could there be less household stress? And we have a few different measures, so I'll just point on one of them, which is the Hesper scale, which really talks about perceived household stress and needs of them. And we have some other mental health related measures I could talk about in the Q&A as well. But essentially, what we see is virtually no change in household stress during this period of time. And from the qualitative, what we think is happening is that they might actually, the positive and negative effects of cash might actually be canceling themselves out. And so on the positive side, women report that it could reduce household tension, it increases their self-efficacy, reduces their stress. But on the negative side, there's still a lot of community and family jealousy around why certain families are targeted or recipients of cash and they might not be. And there was a huge amount of stress of what's going to happen when the program ends because they're so short-term in nature. And I think Burke's talk point to this as well. Moving back up to the other line around, if we give cash to households, is there any changes in decision making or empowerment? And we have a number of different measures in the survey around this question, but this is just an illustrative example. And I think overall what we're seeing is that it is trending towards more joint decision making for women in the home. And so this is just looking at, how decisions are made around household item expenditures. And we see that both equally, the man and the woman are increasing their joint decision making from 19% to 31% between baseline and end line. So overall, those are fairly positive indications around joint decision making. And then finally, we wanted to see, is there any change in intimate partner violence before and after the cash programming? And unfortunately, what we see overall is that the frequency of past 3-month intimate partner violence is increasing, and then the 3-month period again is really related to when cash transfer programmings are being delivered, because we didn't expect to have any changes after the cash programs or the cash transfers were spent after the last transfer. And so we see significant increases, particularly in sexual intimate partner violence, which our colleagues on the ground feel like that's most likely related to the fact that that's the form of violence that will most likely have a man be able to reassert his power over women as opposed to the other forms of violence. And then in addition, looking at economic abuse, we see increases in that. And for those unfamiliar with economic abuse, it's really around control, taking money against your will, and different factors that we try to measure around that. And it's really interesting, I think, too, if we think about the decision making being better overall or more joint decision making, but with this economic abuse piece, it means that it might not actually be equitable, right? So we have to unpack that a bit more. So overall, this is our final theory of change of what we think might be happening within these acute emergency humanitarian aid programmings in terms of cash and women's experiences of violence. So again, it's helping them to meet their basic needs, and there's less economic related negative coping, but it's really not hitting on those protection outcomes that we would like to see. And then in addition, there are some positive or somewhat mixed findings on the decision-making piece, and there still is a potential for increase in intimate partner violence. So the interpretation, and again, these are still very, very preliminary in nature, so we're still having a lot of consultations with a number of different folks on what this study actually means. But overall, what are key takeaways is that cash is acceptable and it's widely preferred by women. Despite any of these negative outcomes that we might have seen, they needed cash and they wanted it, and they were not. It's still their preferred mechanism in these settings of receiving aid. Cash also met its primary goal of helping women and families meet their basic needs, but there must be consideration to monitor and reduce risks related to changing household dynamics. And I think Tenzin's presentation will probably hit on this point later on today too, around this risk mitigation piece. And then finally, cash in humanitarian settings may potentially influence women's experiencing differently than other social development programming in stable contexts. So again, very specifically, unconditional cash transfers in acute emergencies for a short time might have a different theory of change and how it's influencing gender-based violence than these broader social development schemes. And then finally, bold print again, causality cannot be That's amazing from all of that. Thank you.
Great, another super interesting presentation. We are going to move now to our next presenter, who is joining us remotely from Nairobi, Kenya. So Karen Austrian with the Health Council, are you there?
Hi everyone. My name is Karen Austrian. I'm Senior Associate at the Population Council based in Kenya. So I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person, but frankly, I prefer the weather in Nairobi in December to the weather on the East Coast. So I'm going to stay here. And I am going to share some midline results from a randomized controlled trial that we have been running here in Kenya called the Adolescent Girls Initiative Kenya, and try to focus on this question of cash versus cash plus and a little bit how it relates to violence. And so I'm presenting on behalf of a range of co-authors from Population Council, the African Population Health Research Center, and ITAB. And then our implementation partners are Plan International and Save the Children. So just to give you a context and sort of thinking about our thinking as we were designing this study, we know that adolescent girls in Kenya face a range of challenges, whether it be early pregnancy, especially early unintended pregnancy, whether it be early marriage. For example, one of our sites is in northeastern Kenya where half of girls are married by age 18. Education and sexual and gender-based violence, for example, rates of acceptance of IPV are quite high. Over half of girls already in adolescence are accepting of IPV. So there's a range of outcomes for girls that are challenging and that we think about when we want to think about what kind of intervention might it take in order to help girls make a healthy and safe and productive transition from being girls into becoming young women. And all of that, though, is sort of adolescent girls typically are not out living on their own. And so all of this is going on often, especially when we're working in marginalized environments, combined with household economic poverty. And so taking that in mind when we are thinking about our interventions. So the two main research questions that we set out to answer with AGIK, first was what package of multi-sectoral and multi-level interventions has impact for adolescent girls. So when we say multi-sectoral, thinking about not just looking at violence, but thinking about violence, education, health, economic strengthening, etc., and multi-level, so saying not just interventions directly related at the girl herself or targeting the girl herself, but also that engage the households in which she lives and the communities in which she lives. And I'll say specifically for IGWG, we're focusing on very young adolescent girls, so they were all ages 11 to 14 when we started, and looking to see if an investment in early adolescence has positive impact as they move into mid-adolescence and then later into adolescence. And then also we set up the design, and I'll talk about that, so we can sort of look at the effect of cash versus cash plus. So what were the interventions that we delivered, and how did we structure the arms? So the first intervention was a community engagement intervention that was looking at addressing violence not from the perspective of sexual and gender-based violence, but also sort of violence as a devaluing of girls in the community. So this involved community conversation groups in each village where we were working. There were a group of adult stakeholders that represented different key stakeholder groups. They went through a facilitated process of talking about girls in their community, some of the challenges that girls face in their community, and what some of the root causes of those challenges might be. And then they developed a community action plan, which they were funded to implement, that was meant to address some of the causes of challenges for girls in their community. The second intervention was an education cash transfer. So that was a payment every other month to the household, conditioned on girls being enrolled and continuing to attend school. In addition, if the conditions were met, a portion of fees were paid directly to the school each term. The third intervention component was a health and life skills intervention, and this is based on the Council's Safe Spaces model, where girls met once a week over the course of the 2-year intervention. They were divided into groups segmented by age, so younger girls 11 to 12 and older girls in this context 13 to 14. These groups are facilitated by a mentor who is a young woman from that community who's older than the girls but not too much older than the girls. And here they receive training on a wide range of topics related to sexual and reproductive health, sexual and gender-based violence, HIV, nutrition, water and sanitation, as well as communication, healthy relationships, gender norms, self-esteem, etc. And then finally, we had an economic strengthening intervention, which was layered onto the safe spaces. So those girls, in addition to the health and life skills, also received training on financial education topics, so learning how to save, learning how to budget. And then in our urban site, they were facilitated to open savings accounts, and in our rural site, they were given home banks or piggy banks in which they could save. And in both sites, they were given an annual savings incentive of about the equivalent of $3 that was meant to catalyze their use of skills that they were building through the financial education. So we operated in 2 study sites. So unlike IRC, this is not in a humanitarian crisis setting. The first sort of pictures on the left is Kibera, and that is a urban informal settlement, quite a large one in Nairobi, that's characterized by very high population density, a lot of crime, and a lot of poverty. And then the second site we implemented in rural Wajir County. And for those unfamiliar with Kenya, it's up along the northeast border, so borders Somalia. It is nearly exclusively a Somali ethnic population, Muslim, quite socially conservative, and also, excuse me, very underdeveloped and under-resourced. A lot of people might say, you know, there. They don't necessarily feel like they're treated as if they're part of Kenya. And just to say, so these 4 intervention packages were implemented in each site. So each site got the same set of 4 intervention packages. And sorry, let me go back one more time. What I wanted to say, but forgot, was that the reason why we set up this the design the way that we did. So part of what I said is we wanted to be able to tease out, to look at what the impact of the cash would be, and then to look at sort of cash plus this empowerment programming. Also in the past, in a lot of our in our trials, we combine financial education with the SRH content, and we wanted to actually be able to separate out understanding what the economic strengthening component was. However, we do suffer from the same problem that Burke highlighted, that we aren't then able to say what is the impact of the empowerment programming, or the quote-unquote plus program, without the cash in this particular context, although we have done other studies in other contexts that have looked at that. So as I mentioned, we used a randomized control trial design. In Wajir, we used cluster assignments. So we're working with 80 villages, and each village was randomized to 1 of 4 arms, so 20 villages per arm. In Nairobi, we did individual random assignment. And this is just to highlight the timing. So we did our baseline in 2015. The interventions ran for 2 years. And I'm now presenting midline data, which was collected immediately at the end of the 2-year intervention. That was collected in mid-2017. And we'll actually be going back next year to collect a 2-year follow-up data. So that's also quite exciting. But the results today are based on the immediate effects post the program, at the end of the program. So now, what did we find? What was the impact at the end of the program? So again, don't look at the whole chart at once. I'm going to walk you through it. So first, I'm going to talk about these 3 outcomes, which we saw in all 3 arms. So first I'm going to talk about the Kibera results in our urban setting. And so these 3 indicators are where we saw change in Kibera for all 3 arms that had the conditional cash transfer. So we saw improvements in primary school completion, we saw improvements in the transition to secondary school, and we saw a reduction in the experience of violence by a male in the past 1 year. So these are results that we can attribute to the cash transfer. Then when we look at, this is just a sample of some of the health impacts. So in the 2 arms where the girls participated in the health intervention, there were improvements in a range of SRH health knowledge. Here, specifically, I'm showing knowledge of modern contraceptive methods, but there were also improvements in knowledge on HIV and on STIs and on puberty and fertility and things like that. We also saw improvements in condom self-efficacy. And I'm not showing it here, but we also saw improvements in social safety nets, which is a big part of the Safe Spaces model. It's not just about transmitting knowledge, but it's also about that it goes on over the course of 2 years. So girls are building social safety nets in their community. They're strengthening networks with other peers, with adult female mentors, etc. And so a range of items that we have measuring social safety nets also produced positive results. And then finally, for the 1 arm that had the wealth or the economic strengthening intervention, we saw improvements in financial literacy, and we saw improvements in girls' savings behavior. So girls reporting that they'd saved in the past 6 months. So where we did not see change is in primary school enrollment, which is not surprising because primary school enrollment amongst that age range is near universal. Where the window of vulnerability regarding education comes in is typically in that completion of primary school and transition to secondary school. We also didn't see any change on gender attitudes, so in terms of either at the individual level or at the household level. So these are attitudes around roles, both amongst adolescent girls and boys, but also within marriage, or the acceptability of IPV. So no change there. And we also didn't see change in our longer term indicators around timing of sex and birth and marriage. However, we didn't anticipate at this stage, as the sample is still quite young, and midline they're 13 to 16, and so that's really what we'll be focused on in our next round of data collection. But what I also want to point out is we did two kinds of analyses. The first, which is here indicated ITT, included everyone in the sample. And the right-hand column, we did another analysis called the treatment on the treated analysis, because participation in the safe spaces groups, there's really a lot of variation. So when we look at girls who actively participated in the safe spaces groups or in the empowerment programming, or in the plus, in quotes for the sake of this conversation, we see that there was, and this is after we control for sort of bias in terms of who might be more likely to participate more frequently, we see that the strength, the effect sizes, or sort of the strength of the impact of the intervention, close to doubles, more or less, across all of the indicators where we saw change in the primary analysis. And so maybe for the health and the economic empowerment outcomes, you would say, okay, well, they got more of the health and the economic content. So it's not that surprising. But I think what is sort of most important to note is that that strengthening in the effect size also holds for the effects that are attributable to the cash. So improvements in education outcomes and reduction in violence. We see stronger impacts of the cash amongst the girls that also are actively participating in the empowerment programming. So now I'll take you through the WGEAR results, but sort of similarly. So here, for all three arms that had the cash transfer, here we see very strong improvements in terms of primary school enrollment. WGEAR is an environment where 25% of girls 11 to 14 were out of school to begin with, and so the cash really did drive a return to school, or for most girls actually enrolling in school for the first time. And it also improved sort of household norms around expectations that girls would complete secondary school. For the girls that participated in the health programming, those two arms, we saw improvements in the household survey, improving household expectations around the timing of marriage. So, you know, basically households expecting the girls to marry later. And then finally, similar to Incubera for the arm where they had the wealth creation or the economic strengthening, there were improvements in financial literacy as well as in savings. Where we didn't see change in WGEAR, so there was no impact on the household economic status due to the cash transfer. We also didn't see any change on violence outcomes. However, what I have to report here is that there's almost no reporting of violence, neither at baseline nor at midline. I think about 3% of girls in total reported that they had experienced any kind, whether it be physical, emotional, or sexual violence. And from our work with our implementing partners, Save the Children, and the qualitative data that we've been collecting, we know that that's not true. But it's very taboo to talk about violence in this context, and the girls just are not willing to speak about it or sort of conceptualize some of the things that go on as violence. There was also no change in SRH knowledge, and a lot of this, as I mentioned, WGEAR is an incredibly socially conservative place. So we believe that the mentors were largely uncomfortable delivering some of that direct SRH content.
Mhm.
And hence we didn't see that improvement. And then we also didn't see any changes in attitudes around FGM or acceptability of IPV. And then similarly to Inqvera, we see these stronger effect sizes for girls who actively participated in the safe spaces groups. So what are the takeaways from all of this? So when we think about, we pose this question, cash versus cash plus. So the cash alone had an impact on the outcomes on which it was conditioned, which is not surprising, which are the education outcomes, but it also did play a role in reducing violence. When we look at the cash plus, we saw that it had an impact on the widest range of outcomes for adolescent well-being. So when we're looking across sectors and trying to improve outcomes across sectors, the cash plus approach is what gave us that range of positive impact. And then finally, that active participation in the empowerment programs. So when girls were actively participating in the plus component, it strengthened the impact of the cash on the education and the violence outcomes. A couple of other final takeaways. So one is that the cash transfer worked, but the context mattered in terms of on which type of education outcomes. So in thinking about expanding this kind of cash transfer, it wouldn't necessarily be to all girls everywhere, but thinking about where that window of vulnerability is for them on the outcomes that we're trying to impact. Another one takeaway is thinking about in these settings like Wajir, really the draw into the program were around education and economic strengthening, be it the cash transfer or the financial literacy and savings, and that gave us a real into the community. And also I think that sort of, as I mentioned earlier, we had a similar study in Zambia that was really testing the health and the wealth creation components without the cash. And it's not an experimental comparison, but there the health and the economic strengthening had far fewer positive effects that they did here. And so one of our theories that we'd ideally like to test in the future is that sort of simultaneously addressing some of the household economic constraints with the cash component potentially created space for girl level change in this case. And that finally, that the impact on gender attitudes and violence differed by site. And these are really two very, very different contexts. So even though there wasn't direct SRH knowledge change or even content being taught in the safe spaces, having this program where we created space for adolescent girls in the community in Wajir did seem to have an impact on households level norms around girls and their roles. So that was quite interesting. Whereas in Inqvera, we really were not able to change norms around violence. And I think that these norms are quite ingrained even among 11 to 14-year-olds. It's very similar to what we're seeing amongst even adult women in Kenya. So those norms start early. So that's where we are. We'll be, as I said, collecting more data next year and seeing if these sort of shorter term outcomes that were induced by the cash and the cash plus programming, what they will translate into 2 years after the program. So stay tuned for more results. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Karen. I don't know if this is on. Yeah, okay. Karen, thank you very much. I'm really pleased we were able to, that the timing was right for you to be able to present the midline studies from this really, results from this really well-designed, rigorous study in Kenya, and I'm sure we'll all be very interested to see the longer-term outcomes as well, and it's nice that you actually have the opportunity to collect those longer-term outcomes. We are now going to turn to our last presenter, and this is sort of what we're calling a lightning talk. It's about 5 minutes and an opportunity for Tenzin Manel from the Women's Refugee Commission to talk about a new programmatic resource that they've developed on optimizing cash transfer intervention. So Tenzin, are you there? Oh, I'm sorry, Tenzin is joining us remotely as well from Vermont.
I am here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Great.
Excellent. Well, hello everyone. I am pleased to join you today. I'm going to be sharing with you very briefly a presentation on tools that the Women's Refugee Commission developed in partnership with IRC and Mercy Corps to integrate cash and GBV programming in humanitarian settings. So from 2016 to 2018, we led the development of the toolkit, which was funded by the United States Department of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And the toolkit helps cash and GBV practitioners to collaborate, on the one hand, to mainstream GBV considerations in cash-based interventions, so looking at that risk reduction, and on the other hand, to use cash within GBV programming to contribute to protection outcomes. So to inform this toolkit, we conducted a literature review and key informant interviews with experts around the world. And we also did field missions in Jordan, Somalia, and Niger to test the extent to which cash and GBV programming is being integrated. As you may not be surprised to learn, while there is effort to integrate these two types of programming, cash and GBV programming, practice is very nascent and there's a lot to learn. So based on demand from field practitioners for practical assessment and monitoring tools, we drafted the toolkit and then adapted it based on pilots in those three countries, again, Jordan, Somalia, and Niger. So cash itself is not risky. It's not inherently riskier than in-kind assistance, but those associated risks, if there are any, depend on context, and they also depend on age, gender, and diversity. So this toolkit assists cash and GBV programmers to do the following. First, collect data on any associated protection risks and benefits associated with the cash using an age, gender, and diversity lens to identify protection mitigation mechanisms corresponding to any risks which are identified. In addition, to tailor cash delivery, so this might mean adjusting the delivery mechanism, frequency, duration, or value of the cash transfers, or those complementary activities that are paired with the cash, which we've heard a lot about this morning, to enhance protection for recipients and their families. And lastly, to inform a monitoring system that's based on those identified protection risks and benefits. So the toolkit has two sections. Each section has assessment and monitoring components and promotes collaboration between cash and GBV actors. So the first section is targeted towards cash practitioners. They're the primary audience, but the tools facilitate collaboration with GBV actors. And this section focuses on safe delivery and use of cash, where cash has multi-sector objectives, for example, meeting basic needs, or a single sector objective, for example, improving food security or access to safe shelter. And section 2 is targeted towards GBV caseworkers, again, to promote collaboration with cash actors. And the focus here is on how to incorporate cash as one tool within the package of assistance delivered by GBV caseworkers to support individuals at risk of gender-based violence, as well as those who are survivors. So using cash for protection objectives. I'm going to speak to you now about section 1, which has two tools and accompanying guidance. So the first tool in section 1, focused on mainstreaming GBV considerations and cash, is called Assessing and Mitigating Risk of GBV in CBIs Through Story. It's a focus group and interview discussion guide. So as colleagues have already discussed, talking about GBV with communities and trying to identify these protection risks, as well as monitor these risks, is very challenging. It's a very sensitive topic, very stigmatized topic. This focus group discussion tool uses context-specific examples of gender-based violence, as well as depersonalized stories to initiate discussion. These stories are cohort-specific and are about circumstances that may lead to a potential risk in gender-based violence. So there are sample story cards for different cohorts using fictional characters. So there's story cards for women, men, adolescent girls, individuals who identify as LGBTI, individuals with disabilities or accompanying minors, And these stories are intended to be used with the appropriate sample group. After the stories, qualitative questions are asked about the circumstances in the story to focus group participants or interviewees. And these questions address a variety of topics, including how cash might impact gender relations, decision-making, and other power dynamics, associated risks and benefits, looking at the individual, household, and community level, recipient-led and service provider-led strategies to mitigate risks of gender-based violence, how delivery can be tailored, looking at the targeting approach, different delivery mechanisms to promote access and safety, what the barriers may be for accessing GBV referral pathways, as well as designing a proper exit strategy. So the focus group discussion guide closes with information on GBV referral pathways. The second tool, which I'm going to speak to you about, is the post-distribution monitoring module. Again, this is section 1, focusing on mainstreaming GBV in consideration, in cash-based interventions. And this tool is to inform the adaptation of CBIs to mitigate GBV risks. So during implementation, post-distribution monitoring is a standard step of cash programming. But these post-distribution monitoring tools often focus on expenditure, appropriate enough, but at the expense of including questions around protection as well. This tool is modular to bridge existing gaps to ensure that any protection risks and benefits identified during the assessment phase using the previous focus group or KII tool are monitored during implementation. In addition, that the risk mitigation mechanisms embedded in program design are effective. The post-distribution monitoring tool is in questionnaire format, and there are both quantitative and qualitative questions. So based on the data gleaned from using this tool, the cash, GBV, and meal teams would then collaborate to analyze the findings and take any action to mitigate safety issues that had come up. Design and implementation of the cash-based intervention should be adapted as needed. So it might be during duration, in response to any red flags from the protection monitoring, that the delivery mechanism should be adjusted, the amount, frequency of cash transfers, seeing perhaps that there are additional complementary activities or services that need to be paired with the cash assistance to ensure protection. Going on to section 2 of the toolkit, which focuses on integrating cash into GBV case management. Again, the primary audience of this section is GBV caseworkers, but there's a role for cash actors here as well. There are 2 tools: a protocol for assessing survivors' financial needs and making referrals, as well as a complementary post-distribution monitoring module. So this first tool, the protocol for GBV caseworkers to assess survivors' financial needs and to make referrals for cash assistance, is based on a tool that originally was developed by IRC in Jordan. And we collaborated with them along with Mercy Corps to adapt that existing tool for use in broader contexts, as well as to be used with other cohorts of individuals at risk and survivors. So including women and girls, but inclusive of other populations at risk. The ISC GBV case management guidelines do not address cash assistance. So this protocol is really intended to help bridge those gaps, and recognizing that cash may be a valuable tool to support those at risk and survivors, but it might not be appropriate. But if we're not asking those questions to assess the need, then we're really missing the boat on a potentially critical tool of prevention, mitigation, and response. So the steps of the GBV case management process are assessment, case action planning, implementation of the action plan, follow-up, and closure. And this protocol includes guidance for caseworkers for each of those steps to contextualize the incident that the client discloses and to assess their need for cash assistance. It's done with an understanding that their access to resources and control over resources, and it focuses on examining how a lack of access or control might trigger or aggravate incidents of violence, as well as support prevention for clients. The second is to determine with the client if cash, alongside regular case management services, is available and appropriate to A, offer immediate life-saving support. B, to ensure access to response services, which otherwise they may not be able to access in a particular context due to prohibitive cost, or their control of resources without compromising, that may compromise their safety if others know that they are accessing these services. And C, to mitigate any imminent incidents of violence from occurring. In addition, there's guidance around action planning with the client if cache is identified to be an appropriate tool. So being very clear how the cache will contribute to another action of the case action plan. And it also provides context-specific safety plans with the client about receiving the cache. So this is tailoring the cache assistance for the GBV survivor even further to ensure that they are not exposed to further harm. There's guidance around how to collaborate with cache colleagues to make sure that services provided are very timely. There's a categorization of different risks of GBV, different considerations for cache assistance, and different response times needed for those different GBV risks and violence disclosed by the survivor. And there's also a sample script on how to communicate with GBV survivors about cache referrals. The second tool within section 2 is the post-distribution monitoring tool for cache referrals for survivors of gender-based violence. So this PDM helps monitor the protection risks and benefits associated with the cache assistance. The GBV caseworkers are responsible for ensuring that the client support systems are functioning properly, and that services are fulfilling their intended purpose. So if cache is identified using the protocol as an appropriate tool, then it needs to be monitored that that cache is indeed fulfilling its intended purpose in that individual's protection. To ensure a survivor-centered approach, the caseworker or their supervisor should be the one collecting the post-distribution monitoring data, which then should be shared with cache partners in a de-identified fashion in order to protect their confidentiality. The PDM tool has qualitative and quantitative questions which focus on the impact of cache assistance on the client's safety and access to services, the client's management of safety concerns related to their use of cache, as well as improving cache referrals. And once those de-identified findings are shared, it's important that there's coordination to ensure that barriers are addressed. Again, that may be adjusting the delivery mechanism, duration of cache assistance for the individual. The toolkit is currently available in English and Arabic, as well as an editable format for further translation. CARE kindly is championing this toolkit and the integration of cache and GBV programming, and will in the near future be facilitating translation into French and Spanish as well. There are 3 case studies available for Jordan, Somalia, and Niger, the 3 settings where this toolkit was piloted. And there's also a short 2-minute video which addresses the roles and responsibilities of cache and GBV actors when integrating cache and GBV programming, recognizing that this is a new integration, and we want to make sure that that is clear because it's not always. I really hope that you all will reach out with questions and share experiences. If you have questions about the toolkit, please don't hesitate to be in touch with me. And I look forward to your questions. I hope that was lightning enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. All right, we are now going to move into the discussion portion of our event today. We have about 30 minutes or so for the discussion. I'd like our 2 speakers that are in the room, if you guys don't mind moving up to the front here, that would be great. And I think while they're making their way up here, I might summarize these presentations by saying that, you know, basically, I think the use of cache as a mechanism to decrease the experience of gender-based violence, particularly among adolescent girls and young women, is not very straightforward. And actually, there were a couple of themes that I felt like were sort of circulating across all of the presentations, and it's complicated stuff related to measurement, related to context, related to short-term versus long-term outcomes, related to risks, and really the need to think about minimizing social harms that might come from using cash interventions, cash alone versus cash plus, and the potential pathways through which cash could have an impact on gender-based violence. So not very straightforward, but fortunately we have really smart people in the room and on the line who've been thinking about this for a very long time. So let's take advantage of that and open it up for discussion. This might work too. Okay, so I'm going to leave this up here for you all. Okay, we'll start here.
Hi, my name is Linda Bruce. Burke, thank you very much for your presentation. Sorry, you're looking at your phone.
I noticed that I didn't bring pen and pad, so I was gonna.
Oh, no worries.
There are gonna be multiple
I just
questions.
need a clarification anyway. So at the end of your, I couldn't write as fast as you were talking. At the very end, you made a conclusion about the type of project you were alluding to, younger adolescents. Could you repeat what your conclusion was?
So, yeah, as far as I can see the literature, there's not a whole lot on early adolescence or adolescence period, other than the things you saw here. Like all the studies that I talked earlier about, they were all from kind of government safety net programs or NGO programs that are targeted to households and looking at kind of adult women who are mostly married. That's not to say that's maybe a majority of the population of interest. I'm not denying that, but I'm just saying that there's a lack of evidence on kind of. So I was, like I said, I know very little about this topic, but when we started our work with IRC and the baseline data came in, I was shocked about the 13, 14-year-olds' experience of sexual violence and self-reported, which must be an underestimate. First of all, 20-something% were already sexually active, and a good third of that had the first act was non-consensual.
Yeah.
So there's clearly a problem here that is, that's very different than the pathways that we think about when we think about, poverty reduction among households, right? So that's what I meant. I don't have good ideas about what, except that the numbers of studies seem to be very small.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, and I also want to encourage the participants that are joining us remotely. You can type in questions on your through GoToMeeting, and we'll ask these questions here. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Nanya Shikala. I'm the national network of 87 organizations working to scale up the quality and scale of cash and emergency. So thank you all for the presentation. It's really interesting. And I'm sorry I missed the first part of Burke's presentation. The question on that is, I think one thing that we've been discussing, I think, within the emergency cash community, I don't want to create artificial divides, but there it is that we've been looking at, what can we really learn and take away from all of the rich experiences and studies done on the development side. I'm wondering, Bert, if you had any recommendations on what are some key considerations, especially when we are working under obviously very tight time pressures and very tight environment, that humanitarian should be really taken into consideration as we design the monitoring program. I also have a quick question for Kate, also on your study too, about any risk assessments that were undertaken before and any mitigation activities that took place. And just for clarification, you mentioned that the program is targeting households overall, but whether women specifically were targeted.
Sure. Is that okay, Kate? Thank you. So a few things that, the whole session made me think about. These are kind of off the top of my head. So as far as I can tell from the literature, that is not necessarily from emergency settings or humanitarian settings, a lot of the pathways for the negative unintended consequences don't seem to find support in the empirical literature. So I'm now talking about non-emergency settings, but nonetheless, if you worried a lot about, oh, if we give cash and we give it only to the women, it might actually increase violence or increase, mental abuse, psychological abuse and things like that. Those are not finding support in the literature. So maybe we can ease up slightly on those, but it's got to be context specific for sure, and there's got to be some heterogeneity. But on average, those seem to be unfounded. These things are mostly on the positive side. Now, on the emergency settings, I think that, thinking even about some of the things Kate said about the Syria setting, I have to think, even our program, it was a 2-year program, and it was too short. And so 3 months, of course, people aren't going to change, what they do primarily on that. So, and I think these jealousies and like spillover effects, like on subjective well-being of excluded people, I think these are real. I think people are trying to some people are trying to push them under the carpet, saying they're not that big a deal. I think they're a big deal. So I would say that as much as possible, have just longer term programs and as much as possible universal programs. If they're at least cluster based, if 80–90% of the people already qualify, just doesn't matter. The rest 20%, just give the stuff to everybody. And then try to make it like as indefinite as possible. I understand there are budget constraints. I'm an economist, but I think that short-term effects are just going to dissipate. So, we hear this even in the United States, even when you have programs for people till they go 18, foster care people think about this a lot, like they're like, well, it's not enough. Like we put them out in the cold, like at 18 and a day, and they still need stuff. And now Lancet recently had a paper that defines adolescents up to 25. So I think we really need to think about these programs. The world that I'm living in now, the big thing is universal basic income, universal cash transfers, and then maybe the world will go there. It hasn't gone there yet. I'm skeptical that it will. There'll always be some categorical targeting, but I think there's no doubt in my mind that until we get out of the state where our programs are working and having long-term effects without when we retrieve the program, we're just better off giving people stuff ad infinitum, right? And if we don't, we're just going to get disappointed afterwards. So I would say, so to your question, essentially what I'm advocating is that if you thought your program should be 1 year, try to make it 3 years. If you thought it should be targeted to 75% of the people, just give it to everybody. Those are as much as feasible. Those would be my and then I think Tenzin had some good points about, these are things we research in regular settings. How much should we give? Who should we give it to? How frequently should we give it? Should it be a lump sum or monthly or weekly? Should it go to a mobile phone or should it actually be physical cash? And those things are all super important, and there's some research on them that you can draw from and see, but they're all bound to be relevant for sure.
And then just to answer the other part of your questions, in terms of risk monitoring and mitigation, typically we always do a post-distribution monitoring survey where we do try to ask questions around family dynamics. And importantly, at least within Syria, one of the criteria for doing research on violence against women in emergency settings was making sure that our women's protection empowerment teams were operational. And so we had already built in these referral pathways for women, and I think that's something that we're working on to really institute more broadly within our cash program, but how to really solidify that link. And then in terms of the household targeting, again, it was intentionally chosen because that's how cash programs are largely delivered in emergencies. And within that setting, about 60% were actually female-headed households, and across the board, though, about 85% were females who actually received the cash anyway. So we're still piecing apart that in some effect modification analyses. And then just to add on the point around universal giving of cash, I think it's a great idea, but at least in terms of humanitarian emergencies, I think what I didn't mention is that we really need to work on our exit strategies. and making sure that's really done thoughtfully and carefully when we're not going to be there long term.
Yeah, and can I just ask if any of our presenters on the phone, Karen and Tenzel, if you want to add to those comments? Hold on, we're unmuting. Okay, Karen or Tenzel, do you want to add?
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Okay. We have a question from one of our remote participants. I'm going to let Laura read it. Shilpa Reddy, who unfortunately left, but I feel it's still good question. Besides Bangladesh, were other countries in which we found cash transfer increasing IPV? All developing countries, any developed countries?
Was increasing IPV from your study. I didn't have any.
Oh, was that?
Your study showed increases
But that was in
in violence
Yes.
following the intervention, right? And that been observed in other settings or contexts?
Sure. I think some of the findings, again, as we mentioned, and I think Laura Heisey probably spoke to earlier, was that largely it is positive, but there are still some mixed impacts, and it's really contextually dependent. And I can't make broad statements right now, but really it does possibly depend on the duration, the amount of cash, how much are we giving families that might influence different dynamics in the home, and really trying to unpack that more as to whether or not there's a plus component or not. So it's still to be determined.
Lots of questions now.
I was wondering, oh yeah, I'm sorry. I'm Julianne Weiss from USAID, and I have a question about, I don't know if you've looked maybe first, if you've looked at like more conditional cash transfer programs or national programs like in Brazil, both of them are Mexico, and if those, are there any, I just don't know, are there any studies on these families? I mean, because these programs have been quite more successful because they are nationalized and there's been some really good anti-poverty effects of them, but are there social effects like IPG in these programs?
Yeah, so I in my slides there is a reference to Mexico's Oportunidades program, and there are a couple of papers on that by a guy named Gustavo Bobonis. He's at University of Toronto. He's looked at IPV in that setting, and he sees large declines in physical, again, violence as a result. But then he also says that he sees increased threats of violence that don't materialize. So that's just one. That's Mexico's. I don't know of anything on Bolsa Escolar or Bolsa Familia. There are though more studies from Ecuador, another one from Mexico. Now Melissa has a bunch from I think Mali and Bangladesh came up. Some of those are I think government programs or large NGO programs. People do make the distinction of some of these programs being longer term and not ending, but that's not actually true. Like, so eligibility is usually based on having a school-age child or something like that, so they age out. But nonetheless, it's true that some of these programs can go 6 to 9 years, so you can have a reasonable future where you feel like protected, so to speak. But yeah, yes, I wouldn't be surprised. And none of that surprises me. Maybe in settings like, but Bangladesh sounds really different to me than like a Mexico, where, that kind of program, maybe the kind of amazing effects that it seems to be having has really to do with changing the lives of these people. But it's, again, not about, I mean, that's the discussion I think for this that's pertinent. What's the role of cash in that, right? And they can't say, unfortunately, right? But without the cash, would people not have come to that program at all, or not have come in the, in the amount of like times they attended, or with the intensity of interest in it, or the interaction effects of like going back home and coming back, like maybe there's an interaction with like being richer now during the program that affects how you interact with that program. But generally speaking, I think in other settings where, like middle income or lower middle income countries where maybe the social setting for women is not as conservative, I'm not surprised that like there's going to be some, because you can credibly leave, right? So, yeah.
Thanks a lot for all the presentations. Very interesting work. So firstly, I think across all the presentations, the issue is violence in this subject, and most studies have, and rightly so, have more like direct questioning. I'm wondering if you could comment on the applicability of other indirect methods such as the stratification and the vignettes, which have been used to kind of capture and measure other behaviors, which also have a social design bias. So, your broad comment on the applicability of these methods, and if you're aware of work which has been done. And secondly, if any of the studies also comment on non-partner violence, whether it is, maybe it is from members within the household or complete strangers, which could be a violence response. But I think I would be more on the impact of non-partner.
Let me just go to Karen and see if she is able to comment on measurement of non-partner violence. Is that something that you all measured in Kenya?
I just sent you a chat. It's really hard for me to hear the questions, although Burke and Kate are coming through clearly, so maybe you can repeat what the question was. Sorry.
Sorry, one of our participants here was just asking about, had some measurement related questions, and specifically wanted to know about measurement of non-partner related violence among participants in the program. And so I was directing that question to you to see if that was something you all measured in Kenya.
Yeah, so given the vast majority of the girls in our sample are not in relationships, let alone marriages. So the way that we structure our violence questions is we ask, we go through a range of asking if they've ever experienced a particular type of violence. So there are 3 or 4 items that measure emotional violence, 3 or 4 on physical, and 3 or 4 on sexual. So first we ask if they've ever experienced it. Then we ask if they say yes, sort of getting a sense of how recently it's happened. And then we ask who the person was that last perpetrated that violence. And so it could be a friend, it could be a boyfriend, it could be their parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a stranger. So that allows for capturing largely non-partner violence. And then we ask a separate set of questions about IPV, particularly for girls that are in partnerships on this study and other studies. But given with adolescents, especially, I mean, some of our other studies where we're also looking at boys, a lot of the violence is between male peers and things like that. So that's how we set it up, so that we're the possibility to capture violence from a range of people in their lives, partners and non-partners.
So I do actually have a fair amount to say on measurement. So we did use in our Liberia study, we did use all of these methods. But yeah, so a few things. So let's maybe talk a little bit about these methods that the question was talking about. So you can do things essentially that hide the respondent's answer, even from the enumerator, right? So one of the things you can do is, so for example, there's a, the name is escaping me now, but you can have a roll a die, right? And add the number of sexual partners to the number on the die, and then tell you that number. So Yeah, I ask her like, how many people have you slept with in the last 12 months? She can say none, but that could literally mean 8, or it could be as little as 3, right? So I don't know anybody's answer per se, but I know the average of the dye. So I can have treatment control averages calculated easily by subtracting from everybody 3.5, which is the average of the dye on a large. So this is one method you can use. Another one she referred to is list randomization, which is that I give you a bunch of statements that are very benign, like, the president of the United States is Barack Obama, blah, 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 and then you're supposed to go true, false, and all of these things, and then tell me the number of true statements in it, right? I know the average in a control population of the distribution of the true statements for the non-sensitive questions. So I have essentially 2 groups in this study. I have one group that got only the benign statements, and then let's say there's 4 of them, and then the average is going to be 3.25 or something like that. And then the other group get all those exact same statements, but then they also have, in the last 12 months, have you been raped? Right? So then she'll say like, this many of these things are true, right? So by subtracting the 2, hopefully I'll get a number between 0 and 1, and that'll be the percentage of people who've said they've been raped, right? So these methods exist. Unfortunately, they're not foolproof. So I have a blog post actually that you can read. There's actually, the latter method actually produces a fair amount of false positives, believe it or not. Right, so it's a strange thing, but it does. And people do these using mechanical Turks and things like that, these online experiments where you know the answer essentially. So it's not even clear that like when I do this compared to a self-report, I'm closer to a gold standard truth. That's one problem. I do like the role of the dye one. It gave us very reasonable numbers. It was easy to implement. It requires a bit of numeracy, and then the girls usually have to use their like hands to add. But as long as they're shielded, it works okay. But even then, I think there's a power issue. Like in list randomization, now I have to split my sample, and then half of them have to be this control, and half of them have to have the sensitive question. Now I have to have double the sample to get anything done. To get around that problem in our study, I actually allocated very little to the non-sensitive questions group. And then that meant that like their mean was very noisy. And now like I get a gobbledygook numbers when I subtract things. Like they're not actually bounded by 0, 1, right? So yeah, I think these methods are there, but the reason I didn't mention them is because I'm actually not particularly hopeful of this avenue for this topic. I think they're great for many other things, but here I think I'm not sure. I would rather really have like in-depth conversations with people, maybe multiple ones. It's going to be very expensive, but even if there was one study, I would be much happier than like 10 studies that all ask self-reports. Do you have?
Just to add on to that, we did do the listing experiments in Syria around sexual exploitation experiences, and broadly it really did correlate and triangulate quite well with the self-reported data, which was interesting and a little bit surprising, to be honest. But the other method I wanted to mention was the use of ACASI, which stands for audio computer assisted self-interviews, and we've used that in Syria and with all of our adolescent girl programming almost. In terms of our interviews, it really takes the enumerator out of the question to limit social desirability bias, but then on the other hand, you're also reducing any potential rapport that might be built between the interviewer to really elicit those experiences. So we're working on it.
Can I actually add to that? So we did the same thing, but by necessity, because the first time we got our VAX answers, they just didn't make any sense, because so in the literature, you have like this phenomenon of like virgin HIV positive people, right? It's like they told you 2 years ago that they were sexually active and now they're not, they've never had sex, right? This regularly happens if you do panel data collection. So it's the same kind of thing where we had a bunch of people who said this ever happened to them, and then now they're saying this never happened to them. And we said, no, there's got to be something wrong here. And we found out that in Liberia, there are like dialects that our field firm was just giving English interviews to. that we thought that they were not understanding it. So what we did is we got people going to a studio and record the questions in a very kind of like dry, like consistent tone in each of the 3 dialects, and then go back to everybody and then just do that section over again. And I can't compare it to a gold standard, but one of the feedbacks we received was that girls were so happy because one of them said like, oh, the machine speaks my language, right? And it's, yes, in addition to the Acacia experience where you're kind of like privately answering like with a machine, you're also getting exactly like your own language and your own understanding, as opposed to like interacting with somebody and then there's all the things that come with it, whether they're from your community or an outsider or whatever, etc. So I think those are promising, but again, Acacia literature is completely mixed on whether it gets you closer to the truth or not.
Another question.
Hi, I'm Holly from Care. I want to thank all the panelists for the interesting presentation. I'm directed to Kate. But a question around the household decision making. This is a classic cash transfer, post-distribution monitoring question we all have, right? And I'm just curious if you all did something bigger and better than we normally do than just asking the question as part of your theory of change was to be able to have more control over the economic resources. Was there something to involve a partner for partners existing in the household or other or something like that? The growing standard.
Sure. I'm a little bit nervous to answer this in front of Burke, but we just used the primary standard questions that are typically used around decision making. So who was most responsible? Mainly me, my husband, joint or equally others. And I know there's a lot of other games or other ways that we can ask these better, but we didn't have an opportunity to explore that in that study. I would say that we did do a lot of really great qualitative data though, where we actually had lifeline histories where we can map out each transfer and then go back and say positive, here's how we made a decision within this transfer, negative experiences below the line, and you can actually see how decision making changes through a qualitative process. But I feel like you have some other things to say on that. No. Okay.
2 more questions, and then we're going to go here and then the final word.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Kutner. I'm also at the bank. Unfortunately, the bank has many different units. We don't always interact as much as we should. So I'm engaged in an initiative where we are developing operational guidelines to program developers, implementers, and frontline service providers on how let me start with the developers. At each stage of the project or program development, what are your operational choices and what are the potential mitigating measures you can take? And if possible, can you do anything to enhance prevention? So it seems to me that we know a lot of the focus of research has been on questioning whether or not certain elements of a program increase or decrease gender-based violence. But I'd be interested in learning a little about is whether or not there's been much testing of, let's say, program elements that actively seek to mitigate, right? Because it seems to me like mitigation is essentially just not doing what we fear might increase, right? And so we're wondering whether measures that apply, tested, and who might know about that could be integrated sort of to the basic do no harm kind of objective. Okay.
And by the way, we're looking at cash transfer, social safety net, cash transfers, conditional work programs for cash food, and sort of regularly repeating voucher subsidies, anything that involves infection. And we have to cast, we're not doing research, so we have to cast the net wide, because this is how wide our program is. And we can't wait for research results to find what the current state of knowledge is
research-wise, operationally-wise. We're doing a little bit of additional qualitative data collection, particularly around the experiences of the frontline service providers that don't always get included in this kind of study, this kind of work. And then we have to come up with our current best operational guidance. Okay, so that's where I'm at.
Okay. Yeah, I actually wanted to see if Tenzin wanted to comment on that at all, given the work she's done around toolkit development. Is she still with us?
I am, and I would like to answer, but if you wouldn't mind repeating the question because it was in and out. I got development of operational guidelines and any specific GBV risk mitigation, but I'm not sure if I captured the full essence of the question before I proceed.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's actually not that for speaker system. So go ahead. There's going to be a small amount of background.
You want me to talk into that?
If you talk into it.
Okay. Hi, Tenzin. It's Stephanie. I work at the World Bank. We're looking at developing guidelines for both increasing any effect on violence prevention through social safety nets, but also on how to mitigate any increased risk. And it seems like a lot of the research is particularly trying to measure violence, any reductions or increases on regular program elements. I'd be interested in knowing, have we done any testing? Do we have any guidelines on whether or not specific mitigation efforts are effective? Is that clear?
Yeah, that's clear, and I could hear you better. Thank you so much for taking the time to repeat it. I think there isn't enough effort, or there hasn't been enough research around specific risk mitigation mechanisms linked to particular risks and their efficacy over a variety of contexts. I think that is a gap. In terms of the operations side, I think there are kind of three buckets, right? One is ensuring quality programming and doing all those things that we know we should, but are not always applied. For example, effective and safe feedback and accountability mechanisms, or it's written in best practice that we need to have multiple delivery mechanisms to meet specific needs and mitigate risks for certain cohorts, and then have the capacity to pivot during implementation if the delivery mechanism itself, for example, is monitored to be a risk factor, right? So from an operational perspective, that takes, it's different in terms of preparedness, right? Or in the first days of an emergency, if you're establishing, if you're going through procurement and whatnot, after you've identified what are feasible delivery mechanisms in a particular context, you need to be thinking about, you may actually be adapting and pivoting from one to the other, and what does that look like on the operations side? So I think there's the good programming bucket, and then what are the actual proactive measures put in place, and as I said earlier, I don't think there's enough research done on those, and then other complementary activities, right? So those are my thoughts. I hope that's a bit helpful, but I think it's important to think about those things like delivery mechanisms, feedback and accountability, and also community engagement. That there are so many opportunities where not just through assessments and monitoring, we're engaging with communities, and to be continually, monitoring any protection risks through different committees that are, set up and engaged with. Thanks.
And our final question back here.
Jeff Jordan, PRD. When I'm not at my day job, my family and I are involved with different populations in the U.S. Homeless, immigrants, and refugee populations in the U.S. So I'm curious as to whether or not any of this is applied. Yes, I particularly think about cash transfers and women in those U.S. refugees who come to the U.S. in immigrant settings. It's very tenuous, particularly for immigrants who may have status, so their ability to actually seek these types of service. We see particularly in this area for the large number of populations here. So I'm just curious, everything from Tenzin to the application of the materials that you presented, or for any of this research, extensive research, it's a whole lot cheaper to go down the street and do this than to fly overseas. So just is any of this being done?
I'm actually going to ask one of our 4 presenters to comment on that because we need to wrap up. Any volunteers?
Don't all speak at once.
I have a related thing to say. Yeah, so apologies, I don't know the U.S. literature at all. I'm sure there is one. There's got to be, but I'm not familiar with it. But this is all reminding me that it's. I mean, even when I was preparing, I was thinking about prevention, and that's what I mainly work on. And then Stephanie brought up mitigation. That's another aspect. It's fine. But I think maybe what's missing is kind of like maybe the best targets for cash transfers are actually victims of IPV or GBV, right? So, and so there is some evidence actually that social safety net programs can lead to increased dissolution of households or marriages, like to some churn. They actually also, the net effect can be 0, but you can have marriages dissolve, but then new ones form among other people, etc. But as those things happen, I mean, if you think about the programs that Stephanie talked about, the bank does, they're all thought about like, you have a household in mind, you have eligibility rules, you have amounts calculated based on X, Y, Z, etc. You're not really thinking about, let's say, a woman now leaving and then being a candidate like by herself, right? And what are the transitions to those, etc. So maybe actually when we're thinking about these programs, one of the things to think about when we're talking about the nexus of these is actually not prevention per se, but treatment for people who are suffering it. Right now, it's just all the reductions that we show are catching those people by accident, right? Like they happen to be poor and eligible for this program, and if they were also suffering from something they didn't like, there might be something better to do. But it's not actually targeting them. And then maybe some simple rules around like eligibility, like based on that, and then what happens like to those people separately from general eligibility rules might be something to think about. I haven't seen anything about that at all. The governments may be very shy to even, kind of like publicly talk about this kind of stuff in the context of their safety net programs, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't think about that.
Does anyone in the room have an answer to Jeff's question? Anybody familiar with the U.S. literature?
A little bit. I went to gender and there was a complaint from a homeless shelter in New York where they did that. They gave cash transfers to. They found to the shelter and domestic violence. The women couldn't stay in the apartment buildings because the landlords wouldn't give them places. Those people had a household wasn't allowed to live in the building, so they ended up in the shelter. But what they did is they gave transfers and other safety and child care for the days with the best.
Okay, so I'm going to bring us to a close here, and let's start by giving a round of applause to our presenters. And I want to say just 3 quick things. The first is, as all of you probably know, we are in the middle of the 16 Days Against Gender-Based Violence campaign, and there's a lot of competition for events related to violence and gender and women's empowerment during these 16 days, and so we're really grateful that you chose to come to our event today. Secondly, if you are not, there are some new faces in the room, which is great to see, and if you are not a member of the IGWG, the Interagency Gender Working Group listserv, there is I think a sheet at the back of the room where you can sign up. And it's a great community of practice, and anything that the GBV task force in particular does gets disseminated through that listserv. So we encourage you to sign up for that. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is also, as part of the 16 Days campaign, the GBV task force has produced a new infographic that we'll be releasing this week. So it'll come out through through the listserv. That's probably the best way to receive it, but it'll also be on the IGWG website. But it's a nice infographic that synthesizes some new data around really the far-reaching and multi-sectoral impacts of violence against women at individual, economic, country, and global levels. So, and then actions that need to be taken. So be on the lookout for that. And that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you all for coming.
No, yeah, it was really